And so while the regime may hope this, that the world will eventually accept Iran as a nuclear weapons state, and in fact, President Ahmadinejad has said things very much like this, that Iran is a nuclear country and that the world simply needs to accept it. I think this is very much the thinking in Tehran, regardless of exactly what point we deem their nuclear program to be at. I think they can have no illusions, though, in Iran, and I don't think they do, that the pursuit of nuclear weapons and rapprochement with the United States are compatible with one another. And there are plenty of people, and who I respect a lot, who say that Iran does, in fact, is genuine in its desire for better relations with the United States. And I think that's probably true of many Iranians. But I think the regime, as an entity, and the supreme leader in particular, actually sees better relations with the United States as a threat, not as a prize, to his power and to the system of government that's in Iran. Why? Because a rapprochement with the United States would not only undermine a key pillar of the regime, as written about by Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, that being anti-Americanism, but would also imply an opening towards the West, towards the world, really, which would threaten the regime's grip domestically. The last thing I think this regime wants is some things like membership in the WTO and sort of free economic relations. Those ideas have been, in fact, explicitly rejected in the past inside Iran when proposed by senior ranking officials. And I think this is increasingly true as we see this consolidation of the regime in power inside the regime in the hands of hardliners who don't see an opening to the West as a positive thing. So the pursuit of nuclear weapons, conflict with the U.S., in my view, serve the regime's view of its own interests, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised that they haven't accepted our overtures, our deals, our compromises, and so forth. Which leads me to sort of the current state of U.S. and international strategy. There was, I think, in the 2008 campaign, there was prevailing this view that engagement had not been tried. 30 years, there was essentially no dialogue between the United States and Iran. Those people, and there are many here at this institute, who have a background in U.S. Middle East policy, know that this isn't the case. Every president, in fact, from Jimmy Carter onwards, has in his own way tried to reach out to the Iranian regime. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, all of them had some kind of outreach to Iran. George W. Bush, in fact, had negotiations with the Iranians in two separate episodes. You can argue that this engagement is different, and I think it is different in meaningful ways, but engagement itself is not a new idea. And I think that we spent the first year of this administration learning that this is not a silver bullet, that merely making the overture will not bring the Iranians to the table. Ali Larijani, who is now the Speaker of the Majlis in Iran, once said something. He said that the U.S.-Iran conflict was not a quote-unquote emotional issue to be solved with, quote, fine words. And I think we're seeing that Larijani was, in fact, he knew what he was talking about, that this is not a matter of appealing to the emotions of the Iranians. So why has engagement failed, despite repeated attempts? First is what I mentioned before, that in my view, the regime sees rapprochement with the United States not as a prize to be won, but as a threat to be avoided. So why, therefore, do we see this constant process of dialogue and negotiations taking place? Why do the Iranians come to the table episodically to have talks with us? I think that while they don't value necessarily the outcomes, the actual rapprochement, I think the process is valuable to them and is something they want. Why? Because I think they like the optic of sitting across the table from Americans, from the P5+1, the great world powers, essentially, as, in their view, a peer. Because this, I think, is how the Iranian regime sees itself in the world. Not as a peer of these regional powers, as is stated in the article, but as a peer of world powers. And certainly sitting across the table from the United States and debating the regional and global issues enhances this view that they are the hegemon. This possibility is often difficult for Americans to accept, that someone doesn't want to be friends with us. We're apt to attribute the difficulties in U.S.-Iran relations to historical misunderstandings, of which there are many, bad timing, which is certainly true. There's been many lost opportunities, I think, in U.S.-Iran relations. But are these things the proximate causes of our conflict with Iran and our inability to resolve it? I don't think so. There have been plenty of other relationships where we've had historical misunderstandings, bad timing, and we've overcome those things. Look at our relationship with Russia, which is now on a much better footing, obviously, than it was some time ago. Why is it that this one particular relationship has proven so difficult to resolve? I think we have to consider that it's because of divergent interests, not simply because of historical misunderstandings. It takes two to tango, as they say. If this reconciliation will never work if both sides aren't sincere about wanting it. So now we've moved into the sanctions phase, and I think if we haven't learned it already, we soon will learn that sanctions also are not a silver bullet, just like engagement. We've heard recently sanctions are beginning to bite. I think that's true, that this last round of sanctions has taken some in the Iranian regime by surprise and how much they have bitten. But I don't think that means we'll see a shift in Iran's strategy. I don't think it is enough. And our tendency to impose sanctions and then engage in a sort of victory lap and let time pass works not in our favor but in the regime's favor. If you look at sort of the things that transpire in the aftermath of sanctions, we've had, in just a couple days, we're going to see the reactor at Bushehr fueled by the Russians, and we'll see a ceremony with a very prominent Russian official there. We've seen the U.S. National Security Advisor not ruling out a head of state meeting between President Obama and President Ahmadinejad. These things all allow the regime to tell Iranians that, in fact, it is not isolated, that, in fact, it can weather these sanctions, and that international pressure is not working. And this, ironically, discredits the whole idea of sanctions, and it means that to shift Iran's strategy, to knock Iran off its course, more extreme measures ultimately need to be complemented because of the incrementalist type of approach that we've taken. Why haven't sanctions worked? One, because they have been incremental, unfortunately, over the span of many administrations. But second, because we have multiple and I think often conflicting goals for sanctions. First, we want sanctions to make Iran feel isolated, which means those sanctions need broad international support. Usually we try to get unanimous support in the Security Council, which means ultimately you're watering down the sanctions. That's necessary to get that kind of support. But second, we want them also to have an economic impact, to really hit the regime in a significant way that they feel, which means they need to be effective, which of course stands in contradiction to the first goal of making them diluted enough so that they'll enjoy broad support. But then third, we also want them to be very narrowly targeted and to spare the broader population from any pain. So accomplishing all three of these objectives with sanctions has proven very difficult, and I think we'll see as we go forward that in fact it will not be tenable, that one or more of these goals will need to be laid aside, whether it's the broad international support, whether it's the narrowly targeted, and well, of course, we're not going to lay aside the effective, hopefully we won't lay aside the idea of effectiveness. And I think that has a serious implication. So the idea, pursuing sanctions will become more and more difficult, and it will probably become lonelier as well for those countries that take this issue very seriously. And so what does that mean for us as we move forward? I'm going to wrap up here soon because I don't want to take up too much time. And I think the Q&A will be probably more interesting than hearing me go on by myself. So I'm only going to briefly discuss the options which do remain to us to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.